Welcome to Watch Cozy. Today, we're setting off on a journey, really, through the story of Turkey.
It's such a fascinating history.
It really is. And while it stretches back, way back, our focus today is mostly going to be on the era of the Ottoman Empire.
Right. A huge chunk of history right there.
Exactly. It's the story of a land bridging two continents, ancient roots that grew into this incredibly powerful and, well, very long-lasting empire.
You really have to start with the geography, I think. It's just so fundamental.
How so?
Well, Turkey straddles Asia and Europe. It's physically in both. And that Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul, that's the key dividing line, the waterway connecting them. It's always been a connector, hasn't it? East and west.
Absolutely, a natural crossroads.
Yeah.
And even before the Ottomans, this land was just soaked in history.
Oh, definitely. You've got ancient Anatolia, of course, but also a significant European presence as part of the Roman Empire.
Right. And that whole relationship between Rome and its eastern neighbors, that was complex.
Immensely complex.
Yeah.
And long. We're talking centuries of interaction, sometimes war, sometimes trade, sometimes diplomacy with powers like the Parthians, then the Sasanians, and of course the Byzantine Empire later on.
You mentioned these 682-year wars before we started. That number is just staggering.
It is, isn't it? It really paints a picture of sustained, maybe low-level, but constant interaction and conflict. Think about how that shapes military thinking, diplomacy, everything over generations.
Wow. And it was right in the middle of all this that Emperor Constantine the Great made a huge decision, right? Moving the capital.
Exactly. In the 4th century AD, he moves the Roman capital to Byzantium.
Which gets renamed Constantinople.
Becomes Constantinople.
Yeah.
The new Rome. Immensely important strategically and symbolically.
And that decision had massive consequences down the line.
Huge. It really set the stage for the eventual split of the Roman Empire into the eastern and western halves. The West, well, it eventually crumbled.
But the East survived.
The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, as we often call it, carried on for another 1,000 years. Quite remarkable.
And at that point, the land we now call Turkey was basically the heartland of Byzantium.
Largely, yes. Though, like we said, parts of it were always contested, especially in the east, with neighbors like the Sassanids. He was often caught in the middle.
Which brings us to, well, the big question. How did this Greek-speaking, Roman-influenced Byzantine land become Turkey? Where did the Turkish people actually come from?
Yeah, that's the key transition, isn't it? The general consensus is that Turkic peoples migrated westward.
From Central Asia.
From Central Asia, yeah, their ancestral homelands. Now, it's worth remembering, there were earlier Turkic groups in Europe.
Like the Huns and Avars.
Exactly, much earlier. But the ancestors of the people who settled Anatolia and formed the Ottoman Empire, they came in a later wave.
Okay, so who were these later arrivals?
This is where powerful Muslim Turkic empires enter the picture. Think of the Seljuks.
Right, the Seljuk Empire was massive.
It really was. Covered modern Iran, Afghanistan, a big chunk of Iraq, and crucially, much of what's now Turkey.
And they were major players during the Crusades, weren't they?
Absolutely key players. Their Turkic origins and their adoption of Islam really shaped how they interacted with Byzantium and the Crusaders. But, like most empires.
It didn't last forever.
It fragmented eventually. You get other powers rising like the Khurram Shahs, El Boya, all sort of under the umbrella of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Until the Mongols arrived.
The Mongols, always changing the game.
Completely reshuffled the deck across Asia and the Middle East. And it's sort of in the aftermath of all that upheaval that we see a new local power start to emerge in Anatolia.
Almost on the frontier.
Very much a frontier power initially, led by a warrior named Osman.
And that's the beginning, Osman Ador.
That's the seed, the very beginning of what becomes the Ottoman Empire.
And the duration is just mind-blowing. Over 600 years.
6 centuries. From the 14th right up to the early 20th century, think about the changes the world saw in that time.
It's incredible, and the sheer size of it at its peak.
Southeast Europe, West Asia, North Africa.
3 continents.
3 continents under one rule. It speaks volumes about their power and, well, their staying power.
Just to put it in perspective, they were around when the Safavids rose in Iran.
A major rival. We'll definitely get into that.
And still around, astonishingly, in the early days of Nintendo.
Huh. It sounds strange, but it's true. It really connects these seemingly distant historical periods.
So how did Osman and his followers manage it, starting small on the frontier?
Well, they were effective warriors, for sure. Consistent military success was key. But they were also smart, making strategic alliances. And crucially, they were right there as the Byzantine Empire was weakening.
They capitalized on that decline.
Absolutely. As Byzantium faded, the Ottomans steadily pushed outwards, took more territory, and built up their own authority. They were very effective at consolidating their gains.
And then comes the moment everyone knows, 1453.
The big one. Sultan Mehmed II the Conqueror takes Constantinople.
The fall of the Byzantine capital. Muslim rule established in the city, renamed Istanbul. That's just a watershed moment in history.
It really is. The symbolic weight of Constantinople, the new Rome, falling. It sent shockwaves everywhere, especially across Europe. It fundamentally shifted the power balance.
And Mehmed II knew it, didn't he, calling himself Caesar of Rome?
He absolutely understood the significance. Claiming that title, even aiming to eventually take Rome itself, it shows incredible ambition.
A real sense of destiny.
Definitely. And after Constantinople, the expansion didn't stop. They pushed further into the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania.
And even tried to get into Italy?
They made attempts, yes, gaining a foothold there. It's interesting to contrast this rapid Ottoman expansion with what was happening next door in Iran.
Right. Iran hadn't quite consolidated yet.
Not yet. The Safavids, who would build a strong centralized Persian state, hadn't fully emerged. That was still about half a century away. So the Ottomans were really the dominant expanding power in the region at that moment.
Pushing westwards, making big gains.
In Europe, North Africa, they were becoming a major force across multiple fronts.
And this leads into what's often called their golden age, right? The 15th, 16th centuries.
Yeah, that period sees continued expansion, growing power, and a lot more wealth flowing in.
Starting with Sultan Selim Muris.
Selim really kicks off that era of glory and riches. And interestingly, his reign coincides almost exactly with Shah Ismail establishing the Safavid dynasty in Iran.
Setting up that great rivalry.
Exactly, a rivalry that would define the region for centuries. But Selim also looked south. His conquest of Egypt was huge.
Why Egypt specifically?
Trade routes. Control Egypt, you control the lucrative spice trade coming towards the Mediterranean. Plus, it massively boosted their naval power in the Red Sea. Big economic and military win.
Got it. So controlling the flow of goods, basically.
Crucial artery of global commerce at the time. Huge wealth, huge influence, and they kept pushing west and North Africa too. Algeria became an Ottoman state.
And then comes probably the most famous sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent.
So, yes, often seen as the peak, one of the greatest Ottoman rulers. His conquests were impressive. Belgrade, large parts of Hungary.
He even besieged Vienna, didn't he? Twice.
Twice laid siege to Vienna. That definitely got Europe's attention and caused a lot of anxiety.
I bet. But it wasn't just Europe, was it? The rivalry with the Safavids continued.
Oh, absolutely. Constant friction in the east, fighting over territory in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and access to the Persian Gulf. Those were strategically vital areas.
And Suleiman was playing the geopolitical game too, forming alliances.
Yes, famously allied with France against the Habsburgs that Spain and the Holy Roman Empire tied together then. It shows how complex the politics were. The Ottomans weren't just invaders. They were major players in the European balance of power. And they pretty much controlled the Mediterranean Sea at this point.
And there was a religious angle to all this as well.
Very much so. The Ottoman Sultan claimed the title of Caliph, leader of the Islamic world. The Spanish and Habsburgs positioned themselves as defenders of Christendom, so religion was deeply intertwined with the power struggle.
And their reach went even further, beyond the Mediterranean.
Oh, yes. They were actively competing with the Portuguese, way out in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia.
For trade.
For trade routes, for influence. It was a truly global competition for power and resources.
But even at this height, were challenges starting to appear? Towards the end of the 16th century?
Yes, you start to see some economic headwinds. Things like inflation, financial crises start popping up.
Right.
And this is happening around the same time that Europe is getting flooded with silver and gold from the Americas.
The New World wealth. That must have shifted the economic balance.
It certainly had an impact globally, and the Ottomans weren't immune. Now, how you interpret this period? Well, historians differ.
The old view was decline setting in.
Right, the traditional narrative. But more recent scholarship sees it as more nuanced. Maybe not outright decline, but certainly facing new pressures, even while strengthening in other areas. It wasn't necessarily a simple downward curve. You still see vibrant economic activity. Look at Cairo in the 17th century, booming because of the coffee trade. It became a huge economic hub within the empire. So there's still dynamism.
And militarily, they were still very active at the end of the 16th century.
Oh, hugely active. fighting across this vast area, from campaigns touching Russia down through the Mediterranean, dealing with Cyprus, Malta, Venice. They even raided near Moscow in 1571.
But weren't there setbacks too? Malta.
Malta was significant, yes. The unsuccessful siege there in 1565. It didn't cripple them, but it did dent that image of Ottoman invincibility in Europe. Sure, they could be stopped.
And meanwhile, the Europeans were finding new ways to trade.
Exactly. The Portuguese, then others, sailing around Africa to reach Asia directly.
Bypassing the Ottoman middlemen.
Precisely. Over time, that reduced European dependence on the traditional land and sea routes the Ottomans controlled. It chipped away at a key source of their economic power. The Cape of Good Hope route was a game changer.
And what about the eastern border? With the Safavids?
Things shifted there, too. In the early 17th century, Shah Abbas, the Great of Persia, had a lot of success against the Ottomans.
So the Ottomans lost territory.
They did. It marked a definite shift in the balance of power between those two rivals.
Were there changes happening inside the empire as well?
Yes, the 17th century saw some interesting internal developments. There's a period sometimes called the Reign of Women, where figures within the imperial harem wielded considerable influence, and the power of the grand viziers, the chief ministers, also grew. So it wasn't just external factors.
And then came that second siege of Vienna.
1683, the second attempt, and this one failed decisively.
A major turning point.
A huge turning point. It marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe and led to the loss of significant territories in the wars that followed. The tide really turned against them in Europe after that.
And other powers were rising.
Absolutely. Russia was becoming a major force to their north, and Britain and France were expanding their colonial reach, especially eyeing North Africa. The Ottomans were facing pressure from multiple directions.
Let's shift focus a bit from the wars. What was happening internally? You mentioned resistance to change before.
Yes, and a prime example is the printing press.
Right, it took ages for them to adopt it.
Centuries after Gutenberg in Europe. The first books printed by Muslims in the Ottoman Empire only appeared in the 18th century.
Why the delay?
Significant opposition from religious scholars, from scribes whose livelihood was threatened. It just shows how hard it could be to introduce new technologies or ideas.
But eventually things did start to change. Institutions were founded.
Slowly, and often facing pushback. You see things like the Technical University of Istanbul established, but it wasn't always a smooth process. Opposition, temporary closures. It was complex.
It makes you think about reform efforts elsewhere, like Peter the Great in Russia just forcing modernization through.
Exactly. Different contexts, different internal dynamics. The Ottoman path to reform faced unique hurdles.
And the 19th century saw a big push for modernization, didn't it? Because the gap with the West was becoming obvious.
Very obvious.
Yeah.
Militarily, technologically, administratively. So yes, the 19th century is full of reform efforts, the Tanzimat period. Ambitious reforms, but
often seen as failures or limited success.
Historians often view them as having limited immediate impact, yes. Lots of internal resistance, external pressures complicating things, but you can't dismiss them entirely.
Why not?
Because even if they didn't fully succeed then, they laid absolutely crucial groundwork. They planted the seeds for the changes that would come later, for figures like Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The foundations of modern Turkey were being laid, even if imperfectly.
What kinds of things are we talking about? Specific reforms?
Oh, a whole range. Printed banknotes, a modern postal system, a more organized financial system. Even a parliament was established, a national flag, an anthem, a census.
Serious institution building.
Definitely. New schools like the Dar al-Funun, teacher training colleges, ministries for health and education, urban planning for Istanbul. It was a concerted effort.
It's interesting to compare that pace with, say, reform attempts in Iran around the same time, like Amir Kabir's efforts.
Yes, and it highlights different starting points and different challenges. When we look at what Ataturk or Reza Shah achieved later, we have to remember the institutions and reforms, however flawed, that were already in place or attempted beforehand.
So, more 19th century advancements.
Telegraph networks were built, railways started, factories were established, a central bank, the Ottoman Bank, was founded, even licenses for private newspapers and publications. Clear moves towards a more modern state structure.
But despite all this, the empire kept weakening.
It did, unfortunately. Internal pressures were immense, especially nationalism in the Balkans. Serbia, Montenegro, Moldova, others breaking away.
Leading to that label, the sick man of Europe.
Exactly, a grim nickname. but it reflected the reality of its declining power and territorial losses, and external pressure from European powers was constant.
Even when Britain and France helped them in the Crimean War.
That was purely strategic. Supporting the Ottomans against Russia wasn't about friendship. It was about preventing Russia from getting too powerful and controlling the Black Sea Straits. Geopolitics.
And that war had other consequences, too. Demographics.
Huge demographic impact.
Yeah.
Large numbers of Crimean Tatars and other Muslim groups migrated from territories lost to Russia into the remaining Ottoman lands. This significantly affected the population mix, especially in Anatolia, contributing to the makeup of modern Turkey.
So fast forward to 1914. World War I is about to break out. What state was the Ottoman Empire in?
Significantly weakened, definitely, but still vast. Population around 28 million.
And a large chunk of that was in what would become Turkey.
About 17 million, yes, within the core Anatolian and Thracian territories that formed the basis of the modern republic.
And their involvement in World War I, which we've talked about before.
Yes, that ultimately proved to be the final chapter. It led directly to the empire's dissolution.
And the emergence of the Republic of Turkey under Ataturk.
Exactly. The end of one era, the beginning of another.
It's just such an immense story, isn't it? The Ottoman Empire. So complex, so many layers.
Absolutely. From those small beginnings with Osman, through centuries of incredible power, spanning continents, and then that long period of transformation and eventual dissolution, it shaped so much of the world we know.
We've really only skimmed the surface today. The geography, the conquests, the golden age under rulers like Suleiman, the rivalries, the internal struggles, those early attempts at modernization.
There's just so much more you could delve into. Its cultural achievements, its legal system, the day-to-day life across such a diverse empire.
Absolutely. And its legacy is still felt today, isn't it? In the politics, the culture, the very borders of many countries in the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa.
Without a doubt, its impact was profound and long-lasting.
So thinking about this vast sweep of history from Byzantium to Ataturk, what aspect of this incredible story stands out most to you now, or perhaps poses the most interesting question for us to ponder?